Okay, I wanted to talk about hope. I think that hope sometimes can be associated with precognition in a way as if in order to be hopeful, you need to have evidence that things are going to go well in the future, as if hope was simply a matter of knowing what's going to happen in the future or trusting your intuition about what's going to happen in the future. And that therefore there can be situations where it is not good to have hope. Now, in a broad sense, I would probably agree with that, but I think that there is another way of seeing hope, which is more as an attitude, that you can be hopeful as in you're working in a certain way, you're acting in a certain way. It doesn't really matter where those actions or those events lead or where they climax. Right? I think that a lot of the times when we talk about hope, we're focused very much on there is a climax moment which will decide whether things went well or not. It almost feels like it's something derived from the old kind of religious idea that in the apocalypse there is judgment. Things are judged. What things went well, what things didn't. And until that moment comes, there is no way of knowing whether things are going well or not. You can just have hope. But I think that sometimes this moment of judgment, it may come many times, in many ways, at many different levels. You may continually get opportunities to see whether your hope was right or not. And therefore, it may not work to treat hope as a thing that you are doing before the judgment. Like, okay, I hope this works out, but when this day arrives, I will know whether my hope was ill-founded or not. I think this is somehow an attitude towards hope that we hold in our culture. And it already suggests that hope somehow is about knowledge. It's not about doing, it's more about like receiving. If you see that there are signs that suggest that you can be hopeful about something, then you have hope. If not, you don't. And again, I think the reason this works this way is because of this judgment moment, like in the future, which decides whether your hope was ill-founded or not. And I don't know, but I feel as if this can sometimes get people into a loop where the worse the external environment gets, the less hopeful they get. Because if you're basing your hope on evidence, external evidence, signs, symptoms, then if the external situation gets really, really bad, all the external symptoms are going to drain you of hope. And if you are basing your actions on hope, it'll get to a point where you won't do anything. If the situation around you gets so bad that there doesn't seem to be any hope for anything, then you will probably give up. whatever that means for you. And I think there is something wrong with this. Again, because it's hard to know where to start. A lot of assumptions are made, I think, in this view. One of them probably is, again, this strangely precognitive thing. Even though our culture doesn't accept precognition, there is this bias towards precognition. I mean, even science, right, is all about precognition. It's all about, science in a broad kind of sense, trying to... One of the ways in which the scientific method is used by our culture is to see what's going to happen in the future, right? What kind of weather we're going to have. Or sort of try and map out the time. So, as a culture, we are investing a lot of effort into precognition. We really want to know what's going to come in the future. And so, in the case of hope, there is this precognitive attitude to hope that says that if you need to somehow know whether the future is going to be good or bad. See, that's another of the weird aspects of this. That hope implies judgment in itself, right? It implies ethics or morality, I suppose, something like that, good and bad. Hope for something good, not for something bad. So it's not just precognition of what's going to happen in the future, but what good things are going to happen. It's trying to see the good in the future. I have hope in the future. It means I see a bright future. I see good. So it's not just a sort of a detached, mercurial kind of amoral information about the future. It includes within it a judgment of whether it's going to be good or bad. So an interest in hope, or an interest in precognition, or discovering the future for these ends, probably means that our culture wants the future to be good, right? And, well, okay, just a sec. I'm kind of jumping around here, but I just feel as if, let's return back to the issue of no external evidence. If the situation around you is becoming worse, then the way that our culture handles hope is to say, okay, there is no hope. I think there is something counterintuitive about this, because if the external situation is good, it means there is a lot of evidence for hope. But doesn't that mean that if the current situation is full of good signs, there is no need for hope? In the sense that if the situation is already good, why do you want the future to be good? Like the current situation is already good. Why are you already betting on the future? And if the current situation is bad, that's when you want to make sure that it gets better, that it heals. That's when you want to find a way to make it better, to make your attitude of it better, your reaction to it better, or to actually change the external world. Some inner or outer change is desired in suffering in order to heal that suffering. And I think that our current attitude to it in culture is that when there is suffering, the more suffering there is, the less hope is seen. it's a very kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but there is an attitude to suffering where it's as if on the one hand, and I suppose I'm mainly talking about secular culture, but not in the sense that religious culture is better, but probably in more of the sense that even not religious and non-religious positions in culture externalized somehow secular. I don't know in what way I'm using that term exactly, but see, that's the weird thing. I suppose I would connect like the opposite of secular to the mystical or something like that. But that implies a personal experience or personal experience of the divine. So it's something that externalized forms of religion and externalized forms of non-religion are equal when it comes to the inner experience of the divine, because it's inner. It can't be outer. So there is something in here that I think pertains to outer culture, let's say, be it religious or non-religious. And I suppose I would advocate, like Terence McKenna, for a reclaiming of personal experience and of the importance of personal experience, right? To be able to say that geopolitical issues aren't more important than inner issues. They are equally important in different ways. Of course, stepping into this terrain is immediately psychedelic, as McKenna would say, probably, because it places, well, I suppose the more importance the inner world gains, the more likely synchronicity is to occur, I suppose, because these inner psychic contents are very, very important. That is to say, they are standing on a pedestal in awareness. You are feeling them. You're feeling their importance. So you are seeing them somehow. And in seeing them, you see them in relationship to the outer world. So this inner psychic content gets perceived alongside outer psychic contents. If you are really like feeling your inner life, then it's very likely that a lot of external things will remind you of that. You won't be able to stop thinking of it. And that's sort of somehow a stepping stone into synchronicity. Everything in the material world begins to appear reflective of the inner world. I suppose this has something to do with hope, in my view, in that when we see the external situation as being bad, and that doesn't give us hope, two things. First, there's just this idea that this lack of hope implies that there is a fear. A lack of hope implies somehow a fear. There is a fear that something bad is coming in the future. And I suppose the culturally accepted ideas of what bad things are in the future are, death, basically, I suppose. death in different ways. No matter how bad an external situation is, it's always kind of like symbolic somehow of one's relationship to death, or the ego's kind of confrontation with the inevitability of change and the passage of time, or something like that. You could maybe even say that at historical times in cultures when apocalyptic hopelessness is kind of part of the media landscape and the general conversation, are maybe times when the inner world is being reflected out in this way. Let us say that an ego death of a sort is, or a contemplation on mortality is happening culturally and is being reflected outside. This doesn't mean that an actual mortality isn't looming, but that the importance placed on it, I think, happens simultaneous with it having bubbled up in the inner world. And when I say an ego death, I don't mean the ego death. I mean, I don't think the ego death exists. I mean, like, one ego death, one period of ego death in the middle of like a historical build-up, and then a change in history after that ego death. And probably, see, that's another issue, and again, somehow related to hope, because it's these moments, these kind of milestones where hope or fear is directed to, right? You say, I'm hopeful about that moment in the future, or I am afraid of that moment in the future. That moment is perceived like this sort of explosive point that will change everything. And these moments definitely seem to exist at a microcosmic level. We experience them a lot. Sudden traumatic events, sudden traumatic changes in our life, moments when there is a before and an after. At a historical level, they clearly happen. Big wars, big disasters. But the question, I suppose, is in what way or how would they happen at a higher level? Such as in the topic of the astrological ages, for example. What would it mean to switch from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius? And would there be a noticeable moment in history, or noticeable, and moment I mean maybe like even a long moment, a couple 100 years or more, that could be defined maybe in hindsight as being, oh, those were the big kind of transition years between the two ages. Is that a thing? Or, and this is an actual question, I don't know really how to even begin to think about this, but I suppose because these changes are, they are ego deaths in some way, and as such they are a synchronicity, they are a melting between the inner and the outer, I think, a lot of these changes. And so the melting between the inner and the outer implies that a lot of the outer is going to be reflective of the inner, a lot of the inner is going to be reflective of the outer, so that, in fact, the external linear time could be reflective of inner issues. And this whole issue of the calendar that I'm interested in as well, that suddenly Monday can be symbolic of something, Tuesday can be symbolic of something, March, April. The actual cut up nature of time itself can end up being reflective of the inner world in a way that forces me to re-question what would it mean for a big change to happen in a specific temporal period. Like, let's go back to McKenna's idea of the eschaton in 2012. That, you can frame it as a change that happens in history on a specific date, December 21st, 2012, I think is what it was. But especially in this case is more sort of obvious. It's obviously chosen to be, or maybe was, not chosen in a negative sense, but let's say that it was a strange palindromic date, right? December 21st, so 12/21, 2012. So there's already a lot of like twos and ones in mirrored kind of form. So the date itself is already an image. It's symbolic. So you could say the event of the eschaton happens on December 21st, 2012, it being an external temporal date, or the eschaton happens in the symbol exemplified by the date December 21st, 2012, which could mean a whole series of things for different perspectives. Like maybe December 21st, 2012 again is like this mirror. It's like the two and the one mirrored on each other. So you could say that a certain event happens in a symbol. We're used to looking at events as happening in moments, right? This thing happens on Friday, in time. But symbolically, if you say this thing happens on Friday, it could also mean that this thing happens in the archetype of Friday, being like the archetype of Venus, in this case. So, would that mean that this event that happens in the archetype of Venus is always happening in the archetype of Venus? Is it sort of eternally present as a potential in the archetype of Venus? And that in that archetype, however we want to spatialize this, in it, this event occurs? How does this symbolic dimension sit with the historical dimension? I think they do go together. At least that's what I would bet on at the moment, based on alchemy. Let's say that there is probably a mix between things happening on specific days and things happening in the archetype symbolized by that day. And how does this relate to hope again? Well, that's the thing, that in these sort of big issues of like something is going to happen in the future, something good or something bad, or an apocalypse, an apocalyptic kind of scenario. That fear, I think it has within it the seeds of an ego death. As if all death is somehow symbolic of ego death. If the ego finds itself confronting death, it has an ego death. no matter how real or how symbolic that death may be and how you define those categories anyway. But so that when a culture is confronted with a collective death, that perhaps all of the material structure that gives evidence for the badness of that situation is reflective of something that's happening inside, and that therefore, and this is maybe the second point of, I opened 2 points ages ago, this is probably the second one, that this psychoanalysis side of it, that I always feel that when things are bad, that's somehow a good sign. And that needs to be taken very abstractly, right? I don't mean that if you find yourself in the street being beaten up, that's good. Whether you are enjoying that or not, or whether you consider that good or not, will be your judgment. But that if you find yourself in a situation that is externalizing something that you were afraid of, in some sense, there is something unconscious that is being made conscious by that. Now, sometimes when something is too traumatic, it can jam the issue deeper down. Right? If something that was stuck in your unconscious comes up in a very traumatic way, it's so traumatic that you completely forget it. You just put it back down. So it's unclear